Here on the Adobes of Glendale, the Verdugo heritage. Experience the tales of California's rich history of early Spanish explorers setting sail on an exploration to discover Alta California. Learn why Don Jose Maria Verdugo was granted one of the largest acres of land by the Spanish crown, and how Glendale is home to two of the oldest historic landmarks still standing today. All this and more on the Adobes of Glendale, the Verdugo heritage. When we look at Glendale today, it's not hard to imagine that this entire area was once covered in endless beauty of rolling hills and exquisite vegetation, which is probably why people like Don Jose Maria Verdugo decided to settle in this region. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the Spanish Empire sent many soldiers by ship to explore North America, where they took over large parts of the New World.
The Spanish Empire, of course, had to have many ships and a merchant navy as well as their own warships. So to this part of the world, for the most part, the cargo was taken to Veracruz, a port on the Gulf of Mexico, and then taken overland, then reshipped north to California. In addition to that, of course, the Spanish Empire controlled the Philippines for close to 400 years, so there was also travel between Spanish ships in Manila that came on many times on a yearly basis to the coast of the Americas.
Don Jose Maria Verdugo was one of many Spanish soldiers who came to Alta California with Spanish explorers and started the rancheros in California.
I think Jose Maria Verdugo was a very interesting man. I believe he was a self-made man in the sense that I don't think he descended from nobility or from the upper classes. He was obviously a mestizo that had Spanish blood as well as Indian blood, but to rise through the ranks as he did, to come this far from his home base in Mexico, to eventually receive a Spanish land grant from the crown to settle this region, he had to have been an efficient person, a learned person, and obviously a very hardworking person.
Don Jose Maria Verdugo was actually from Spain originally. He was living in Loreto in Baja California, and he was serving under the Royal Spanish Army because all of this land was occupied by Spain at the time. And they requested that he come to the San Gabriel mission, and they wanted him to be a guard there, and they said they would promote him to corporal.
Priests were sent out with the Spanish army to establish missions in an effort to convert the native population to Catholicism.
Here in the New World, it was the Spanish missions, the official arm of the Catholic Church. It was their duty to convert the native populations from the tip of South America to North America, to convert them to Catholicism. So priests were sent out with the army with the idea of building a church, of building a mission that would work with the native populations and help to introduce them to the Christian faith.
Don Jose Maria Verdugo was granted 36,000 acres of land in 1784 by the Spanish crown for farming and raising cattle.
He got married and he had 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son, Julio. He retired from the Army early because of ill health, and he spent the remaining of his years just working the rancho. He was very generous. He often entertained here because he grew a lot of vineyards, and they had a lot of crops and beef to eat, so there were many festive activities going on. When he died at age 80 in 1831, he owed no man a penny, and no one could say an evil word about him.
Well, the rancho itself was bestowed upon Don Jose Verdugo back in 1784. And he named it Rancho San Rafael. And he also had a nickname for it called La Zanja, which means a ditch or a little ditch.
During Spanish rule, the rancheros were concessions from the Spanish crown, permitting settlement and grazing rights on specific tracts of land, while the Spanish crown retained the title to the land.
Well, the boundaries of the Verdugo Rancho were quite vast, and they started from up in La Cañada, going through parts of Pasadena, coming down through Glendale, rounding itself up into Burbank, and then ending up into Hunger. Although his brother, Mariano de la Luz Verdugo, had another rancho which started at Hunger and worked further out that direction.
I think life in the ranchos was quite interesting. Obviously, the people that owned, like the Verdugos, the Sepulvedas, the Marquez, the people that owned these large land grants grew to become quite wealthy. So in addition to their own wealth, they also had to provide substance for other people within their, let's call it, jurisdiction. So they employed a lot of people, and it was, in the final analysis, a commercial enterprise. They raised cattle and sheep and crops, traded with other ranchos. So I think it was a very interesting life. I think it was a very comfortable life, especially in a place like Glendale and here in the Verdugos. I think life was quite well. It was a very rich part of the basin with plenty of water and lots of natural plants, and vegetables could be easily grown. So I think they had a very, very comfortable and good life.
After retiring from the Spanish Army, Don Jose Maria Verdugo lived the rest of his life on the ranchero. After his passing, he left his land to two of his children, Julio and Catalina Verdugo.
Well, Julio Verdugo is the son of Don Jose Verdugo. And when Julio took over the land after his father died, he continued on the family tradition of the rancho business, the cattle business. The problem that he had is that when he took over and he experienced the drought and lost a lot of his cattle and had to pay several debts, he had mortgaged the land to actually an individual by the name of Elias Jacobs, and back in 1831. And when he did that, he was unable to repay the mortgage. So essentially he lost the land through the Great Partition. Essentially there was various debtors as well as his own family who wanted to keep their pieces of the land. So there was two lawyers by the name of Glassell and Chapman, and they did the Great Partition. And they divided the land up among the various people, such as Julio himself, Catalina, her nephew Teodorio, Julio's other daughter Rafaela, and as well as the other debtors.
Right before Don Jose died, he asked his son Julio to have a place for his daughter Catalina to live.
Catalina Verdugo, she was the daughter of Don Jose Verdugo. What happened there is that when she was a very young child, she caught smallpox, and so she was left blinded. So she didn't really have a family of her own or married, so she was pretty much taken care of by the other Verdugo members and her nephew, Teodorio. And it was Teodorio who had built this adobe that we're at today. And if you look at Don Jose Verdugo's will, he states in the will that he's going to leave Catalina Verdugo a 2-bedroom adobe. And that was back in 1831. And a lot of people speculate that this isn't that house, although there was an adobe back in those days that she lived in. Probably what happened was that this house was built by her nephew, Teodorio Verdugo, around the 1860s. And she died in here in 1871.
Well, Catalina had to be cared for by her family the rest of her life. And Teodoro was her favorite nephew. So when he built this casa for his family and invited her to stay, not only did the land belong to her, because when her father died, he had left half the land to Catalina, and she had chosen the south side. The other half went to Julio, and he had chosen the north side. So the land belonged to her, and she lived here the remaining years of her life, and it got to be known as the Catalina Verdugo Adobe.
Manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. should expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
Well, in 1847, there was a war between Mexico and the United States. Primarily, it was a kind of a war of manifest destiny where the American government was trying to extend their borders, if you will, to the other side of the coast. And the Mexican government had, obviously, possession of California. So as far as how the war affected California and the California Spaniards at the time, the Californios, was that the Californians kind of thought themselves separate from Mexico to begin with. And they really embraced the American Army and Navy coming in. And it wasn't until later that when the occupying forces, the American military, tried to actually subjugate the Californios, that they rebelled against the Americans. And that's what brought the Verdugo family into more of a peaceful side of that war. Because I say peaceful because it was this rancho, or this adobe, which belonged to Catalina Verdugo, and also the other adobe, which belonged to Mariano de la Cruz Verdugo, where they actually did the negotiations to end the fighting in Alta California or in California. So essentially the treaty was negotiated here underneath the peace oak and signed over by Universal Studios, which is the house of Mariano Verdugo.
Unfortunately, the Oak of Peace died from root rot, and as a result, it had to be removed. There are remnants of the old oak that still remain today.
The Oak of Peace, there was a large oak, one of the 5 largest in California, and it represents a historical time in our life because Lieutenant Colonel Fremont sent an emissary, Jesus Pico, to meet with his brother, General Andre Pico. And Jesus Pico was supposed to convince General Andre Pico to surrender to the United States and give up the land that Mexico was trying to possess.
After Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico acquired large portions of territory west of the Mississippi River.
I think they chose this place to meet because Jesus came from Northern California and General Andre Pico came from Mexico and was kind of halfway between, and they knew that the Verdugos would be hospitable. And so probably they were riding and they were tired and hot and sat down under the large oak. And 2 days later, Lieutenant Colonel Fremont came to Campo de Cahuenga and they signed the peace treaty. And in 1850, we became the 31st state of the United States.
To Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont, delivered up their artillery and public arms, and they shall return peaceably to their homes, conforming to the laws and regulations of the United States, and not again take up arms during the war between the United States and Mexico.
In the early 1900s, F.P. Newport, a real estate developer, purchased the Adobe, and in 1946, the Basher family acquired the property.
My father acquired the property in 1946 by buying individually 11 lots and eventually closing the street, and that led to our finding out the history, and it's, I think, a very wonderful career for Glendale now. But you could just look around and see it was basically 2 adobe rooms and with ragtag furniture or whatever they had in it. Probably the early 1900s, a wood, board, and bat constructed addition was put on at this end, which is now a display room, the dining room, and of course we had to improve the kitchen and the bathroom facilities. So basically it's now 3 rooms and a little service kitchen and storage.
During the 17 and 1800s, adobe construction was popular in California and made out of natural materials.
Adobe is a natural building material composed of clay, sand, and water mixed together. Then a fibrous material is added. And that material, depending on what's available locally, could be straw, could be reed, twigs, and sometimes they used horsehair in it. The material is mixed and then poured into a wood frame. And the frame is approximately 14 inches wide by 24 inches long and about 2 to 5 inches deep. So these bricks, you can imagine, when some of them, when they are made, they're about 40 pounds in weight. The frames are laid in the sun to dry, and when the bricks are ready, they are used to build the adobe walls. Adobes are generally linear in form, and the reason for that is the constraints of the structural system. The early adobes were rectangular in shape and one-story buildings, about 2 to 4 rooms. Adobes are not unique to California. You can find them around the world. In fact, the largest adobe building in the world is in South Iran, and it's called Bomb Citadel. It's around 44 acres of magnificent adobe buildings, dated 6000 BC. Unfortunately, a 2003 earthquake destroyed about 80% of that site, which brings a very important point that adobe buildings are not designed for major seismic activities. So if we want to preserve our adobe buildings in Glendale, we need to seismically upgrade them.
The Spanish and Mexican influence is still alive today, as it was centuries ago, and it serves as a reminder as to how important the past truly is.
The Spanish and Mexican influence is very much alive here in Southern California, not only in Glendale, but throughout the basins, the different missions, the different adobes, and of course Olvera Street, which is the beginning of the city of Los Angeles. It started in that little section of town and grew from there. I think it's important for Glendale and for the rest of California to preserve these adobes and the missions and its history, because it's part of what this state is. It's reflected in the names of the cities and in the food that we eat, and so much that has taken place in this state. And so I'm very proud that here in Glendale we have these adobes that have been, not only with city help, but actually with private foundations, have been restored to their former glory.
To learn what went before is really essential. The people that did the work and made the plans and made the rules and the laws. And it's not only fun to see the real thing, but to give tribute to these ancestors that have made what we have as a good life here.
One is reaching to the west, and one is reaching to the east, and they made peace under this oak.
By having this one casa remain that belonged to them, it leaves a lot of history, and by turning it into a museum, there is a lot of history there for others to enjoy and realize how Glendale was settled.
The rope. And how tight they pull the rope is how well they slept. That's where sleep tight comes from.
One of the reasons I think that the heritage of the Verdugo family in regards to how important that is to the area is that people should know their history. They should know where things come from, because it'll affect not only them now but in the future. So there's a lot to learn from history and how we continue on from that point. But I think those are important not to forget.
It's very important to preserve our historic resources in Glendale because they are our windows to the past. Through them, we can tangibly experience and gain knowledge of past generations in Glendale, their lifestyle, their culture, their history, their standards, the buildings that they constructed, and past generations were very instrumental in forming Glendale. So these historic resources actually are our vehicles to connecting to Glendale's roots.
There's a rich history involving the families that were early Alta California settlers, and because of them, we have these 2 historical adobes that are still enjoyed today by so many people visiting the park sites. If you are interested in touring or holding an event at any of the historic adobes, call the Community Services and Parks Department at 818-548-2000.